Well, I felt the need at this point in the course to take a brief review, relook at the NSPE Code of Ethics for Engineers. Why? Well, I've been giving you cases having to do with the first canon, and I've been giving you cases now that really I intend to have a lot to do with the fourth canon. And I thought it would be interesting to look back at the code and see what it says and what it doesn't say. Specifically, what it doesn't say about, um, about the kind of things we're reading. Um, One of the things that we have repeatedly run into is a very reasonable claim on the part of the Board of Ethical Review that if an engineer has any problem with what's going on in their firm or with a client or with their employer, especially, um, whether that's a first canon problem or a non first canon problem. And we've been looking at non first canon problem, basically, especially this case we're looking at now. Um, Things like 97-12, which have to do with stealing software. This case we're looking at today, which has to do with essentially testing fraud or fraud having to do with testing the quality of microchips, I guess. It's not a first canon case, but in any case, the question, the claim that they make is that before the engineer blow the whistle, which means go outside the company, that they must exhaust all internal mechanisms for dealing with the problem. This is actually in line with what DeGeorge said. That is, before an engineer can be said to have the ethical right to blow the whistle, they have to inform their immediate supervisors of the problem, try to get it resolved, and if they don't get any satisfaction there, they have to be willing to go to the very top of the company, including the board of directors, if it's a publicly held company. And then and only then can it be said to be morally permissible to go outside the company. That is a very reasonable thing, both on the part of DeGeorge and the BER, in saying that sort of thing. And certainly they say that with regard to today's case involving the wafers. But it's not in the code. That is, there's nothing in the code in the first canon, in the fourth canon, and in section 2, where the first canon and all the canons, fourth canon, are specified to some degree, and then in section 3, the kind of catch-all section where other things are included, there's not a hint, there's not a word that an engineer must, if they're working for an employer, that they must exhaust all internal channels before blowing the whistle. It's not in there. It's not part of the code. So what is it then? That is, especially with regard to the BER. Now, the George, he's just a writer saying stuff. That's his opinion, sure. But the BER, I would say, is a little bit more important in their claim that an engineer who does not do that, who does not exhaust all internal channels, is being unethical. What is that based on, really? Well, in one sense, it's made up out of thin air. It's not in the code. There's nothing. Read the code. There's nothing in the code that says that you need to exhaust all internal mechanisms for resolving a matter before you go outside the company. To be generous to them, let's say that if it is based on the code, it's based on the fourth canon. It's certainly a fourth canon type of thing. So one of the things I've said to you about these BER cases is that if the BER accuses an engineer of being unethical, they've got to be able to point to a part of the code that has been violated. Since there is no specific injunction in the code that requires engineers to exhaust all internal mechanisms before blowing the whistle, the only thing they can point to is the fourth canon itself. Act for each employer or client as faithful agent or trustee. If we look at the specification, there's nothing in there that says that you have to exhaust internal mechanisms. So what are they relying on? They are relying on an interpretation of the fourth canon. They are relying on the idea that if you do not try to, exhaustively try to resolve problems internally before going outside, that you are in violation of your fourth canon responsibility to your employer. That is simply an interpretation. Okay. If the NSPE wanted to specify that requirement, they should put it in the code. They should make it part of Section 2 of the code, or Section 1, the whole paramount, um, not Section 1. Section 2 of the code under subsection 1, specification of the first canon, or subsection 4, the specification of the fourth canon. They have not done that. So what they're relying on is simply an interpretation of the fourth canon that it requires an engineer to try to resolve a problem internally before going outside. Again, that is a reasonable claim, but what it rests on, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure at all. So that's what's not in the code. Anything that tells you you have to exhaust all internal mechanism. That is simply an interpretation of the code on the part of the BER and George as well. What is in the code? Uh, Look at Section 2, Rules of Practice, and look at subsection 1, and under that, letter F. Engineers having knowledge of any alleged violation of this code shall report thereon to appropriate professional bodies and, when relevant, also to public authorities, and cooperate with the proper authorities in furnishing such information or assistance as may be required. So that's something that is in the code. There's nothing in the code that requires you to exhaust internal mechanisms. That is an interpretation of the fourth canon again. There is something explicit that tells engineers that they have a duty, shall report, any if they have any knowledge of if they have knowledge of any violation of the code, there's a duty to report it to a professional body or, when relevant, to public authorities. May I also point out that there is no distinction here between public safety issues and other issues. It says any alleged violation of this code. So I'm not saying that the BR is necessarily wrong, but I'm saying that they're not obviously right in what they say. For instance, the claim that engineers have to exhaust all internal mechanisms, it sounds very reasonable, but it is not it's not in the code, and it's not the obviously right only interpretation of the fourth canon. What is in the code is an explicit injunction that you have a duty to report any violation. Now, that may sound unreasonable, but maybe the code is unreasonable and needs to be changed. But in any case, the BER's interpretation of these things is simply their interpretation. And sometimes I'd have to say that interpretation is questionable. Not obviously wrong, but at least questionable.